channel to help those other people rename themselves once we're broadcasting. But I think most people, well, most people, I guess you'll be using a speaker view, so they won't see all those other names. Is that right, Emily?
Correct. It's on speaker view, so it's not a huge deal. Just for us, I'll just start broadcasting, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, great. Thanks. I think we're not yet broadcasting.
We are. Our attendee count is going up.
I see. So I'm now speaking to the attendees. Is that right, Emily?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the first of a series of webinars that we're organizing at the World Resources Institute on Build Back Better, Perspectives on COVID-19 Response and Recovery. We're going to start in just a few minutes. I'll explain how we use the tools. Emily, I'm not seeing myself in speaker view. I'm only seeing your name. Is that what everybody else is seeing?
I'm seeing you, Lawrence.
You are. Okay, great. Then I will just assume that that's good. I'm Lawrence McDonald. I'm the Vice President for Communications at the World Resources Institute, and we've been really pleased and astonished at the response to our invitations. If half of the people who RSVP'd show up, will be close to 1,000 participants. I think that may be the largest event that WRI has ever organized. Some advantages to being in the virtual space. Before I kick off and introduce Manish Bapna, who will frame why we're here, I just want to tell participants there are two ways that you can raise questions. At the bottom of your screen in Zoom, a lot of us have learned about this recently, you can click on the participants panel, and when it opens, you'll see an option to raise hand. If anybody wants to do that, in fact, I would invite you all, go ahead and raise your hands. Emily will then put them all down. She's our virtual event producer. So open the participant panel and raise your hand. If you do that once the event begins, then I'll see that, and I will try to call on you, and Emily will unmute you, and you'll be able to ask your question. If you prefer to submit a question in writing, you can click on the Q&A panel and type your question there. Those questions will be answered by the panelists as we proceed. If your question says, help, I can't hear, then Emily will take care of you and help you. But if your question is, Dan, I really don't understand what you said about the US stimulus package, and you ask a question, then Dan will endeavor to reply. I may also read out some of those questions. I see that we're still getting new folks in. We're up to 630 participants. So I think I'll give that a few more minutes. If you heard me before, we're going to practice raising our hands. Click on the participants panel, and in the bottom of that panel, you will see a raise hand function. Let's see who can be the first to raise their hand. I just raised my hand, but it looks like I'm the only one. Are any of our participants able to figure out how to raise your hands? This will be an important thing to be able to do.
They are raised in the attendees side of it.
They are raised. How do I see those then, Emily?
So next to where it says panelists, there's ones that say attendee.
Aha, great. Oh, look, so there's so many hands up. They are indeed raised. Okay, thank you very much. So we're all learning about Zoom. Thank you. If you've just joined, this is your last chance to raise your hand. You can go into the attendees tab on the participants panel and raise your hand, and then we will begin momentarily. So welcome to Build Back Better, Perspectives on COVID-19 Response and Recovery. I'm Lawrence McDonald, Vice President of Communications at the World Resources Institute. One of the things we've learned in online meetings, I suspect you've learned that too, is that as wonderful as they are, they can be fatiguing. So we're going to endeavor to keep this within the allotted hour. I've therefore asked our panelists to each speak for just 3 to 5 minutes so we can spend time for some questions and comments at the end. I've mentioned to those of you who were online earlier that you can raise questions either by typing them in the Q&A panel or by raising your hand. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Manish Bapna. He is the Executive Vice President and Managing Director of World Resources Institute. Among the many hats that you wear, Manish, is overseeing our programmatic work and increasing the impact of our research. And together with Helen, our second speaker, you're heading a task force on how we rethink our work. And so there's some of the early thinking will be shared in this seminar. Before joining WRI, I knew you, Manish, when you were at something called the Bank Information Center, sort of a World Bank watchdog. And before that, you were actually at the World Bank itself as a senior economist. Welcome, Manish, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Lawrence, and a warm welcome to everyone. Really delighted to see such a turnout. For those of you who may not know, the World Resources Institute is a global research organization that focuses on issues related to sustainability and development. Our approach is that we count it, we change it, we scale it. We're fairly good at kind of the data, the analysis, the research. Our focus, however, is not just about publications. It's about changing policy. It's about shifting investment. It's about informing business strategy. But ultimately, we know that if we're going to truly move the needle, we need to think about scale. And that's where our partnerships with all of you, our platforms, become so critical. We are very much a global organization. Even we're born in Washington, the vast majority of our work takes place outside of the United States. We have offices in about 12 countries around the world, in all of the major continents. So with that, let me say a few words about helping kind of set up or frame this discussion. As we all know, the world looks very different today than it did even just a month ago. We're confronted with 3 pretty profound crises. We have a health crisis, we have an economic crisis that's been induced in no small part by the health crisis, and we have a climate crisis. And the scale and scope of these 3 crises are absolutely mind-boggling. And the exam question for today's seminar is, as we respond to the very immediate kind of economic and health crises, can we also tackle the climate and sustainability crisis? Can we build back better? And we've been giving some thought to this over the past few weeks and wanted to share 4 kind of very high-level insights that have emerged from our early thinking on this issue. The first is that climate is highly relevant to many of the fiscal and monetary measures that are being discussed by governments today. If you think about the bailouts that many governments are putting in place, whether it's around aviation or shipping, will there be conditions put under those bailouts? Major energy oil companies are meeting with Trump in Washington today. What will they talk about? You think about infrastructure. Will infrastructure to stimulate the economy be focused on traditional infrastructure? Or will we look at new infrastructure? China's having a very interesting debate about this and whether they can actually invest in advanced infrastructure that creates jobs, but that's low carbon. Even if you look at monetary policy, you think of quantitative easing, right? Who would have known? But that can have major climate impacts as well. So the first point is that climate is actually quite relevant to many of the fiscal and monetary measures that people are talking about today. The second point is about jobs and livelihoods. The economic recovery programs need to primarily focus on jobs and livelihoods, but we believe climate can be a really important co-benefit. Just yesterday, 6.6 million people in the United States filed unemployment claims for the first time. This is 10 times more than during the 2008 crisis. And the situation in the developing world is going to be much, much worse. And so the question here is, as governments focus on generating jobs, can they find investments that both generate jobs, and reduce emissions. Think of energy efficiency for homes or commercial buildings, things that can both create a lot of jobs everywhere in every country, can actually create a lot of household savings, and can actually reduce emissions. The insight here is that we need to lead with a serious jobs argument, and climate has. The third point, behavioral change. Much of the focus has been on how to integrate climate into economic recovery programs. But there's also something more profound happening, which is certain behavioral shifts. On the good side, whether it's teleworking and virtual conferences, on perhaps the less good side, a aversion maybe right now to public transportation. Which of these behavioral shifts will be durable, will be sticky? Can we actually see or encourage those shifts in societal and behaviors, individual behaviors that lead to more sustainable lifestyles? And the fourth and final kind of point is the need for a new social contract. We know that vulnerable communities, vulnerable countries are going to be the hardest hit from the virus. The health and economic crisis is only going to exacerbate really bad inequality today. And there's going to be a tendency to take care of those that are closest. But we need to sustain commitment to development aid, to climate finance. We need to help encourage a new social contract that will emerge, that will ensure that we do protect the most vulnerable, that effective collective action will emerge to address common threats. Ironically, at a time when we must practice social distancing, we actually need the world to come together. So these 4 points, the fiscal and monetary measures today have actually very significant climate impacts. Second, that reflating the economy must focus on jobs and livelihoods, but we can do so in a low carbon way. The third, we should be looking not only at economic policies and investments, but also behavioral shifts. And the fourth, that we need a new social contract, has been informing our thinking, our work in China, in the United States, in Africa, on cities. You're going to hear about that from all of my colleagues in just a moment. I just want to close with a quick anecdote. Some of you may know that today marks the 10th anniversary of when the first iPad was launched. Hard to believe, but it's incredible how successful the iPad has been, in part because it solved multiple problems at the same time. You could use it for work, you could use it for entertainment, you could carry it anywhere. And in some sense, we need to find those interventions, those solutions today that can speak to multiple problems, that can generate jobs, that can tackle inequality, and that can reduce emissions. And so I hope you hear much more of that in a much more concrete way from my colleagues that follow. Thank you very much. Back to you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Manish. I'm going to hold on to that thought, solutions that can address multiple problems, because I think that's part of the appeal of what we're going to hear from our panel members. I want to turn now to Helen Mountford. Helen is our Vice President for Climate and Economics. Before she joined WRI, where she was at the OECD, and the list of things that you oversaw there, Helen, always astonishes me. Fossil fuel subsidy reform, green growth, water pricing, biodiversity measures, modeling. If it's got to do with creating a more sustainable, just world, Helen has a deep knowledge base on that. She also leads our work on something called the New Climate Economy, which has been remarkably effective in shifting economic planning and development in some big countries, really against all odds. So I'm delighted to hear from you. I've asked Helen to give us an overview of some of the lessons from stimulus past, the 08-09 financial crisis, and I think that'll give us good framing. I should have mentioned at the beginning, our additional panelists include, after Helen, we're going to go in the order of the unfolding of the pandemic. So we have Fang Li from China, Dan Lashoff for the US, Wanjira Matai from Africa, and then we're going to finish up with Anjali Mahendra with a perspective on cities. Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. And I have a couple of slides that I'll show as I talk this through. Now, what we know is that, of course, this crisis is a very different one from the 2008-2009 crisis. This one is the result of a simultaneous demand side and supply side shock. as economies are grinding to a halt. Now, of course, the first wave of government responses absolutely has to focus on the emergency measures to stop the spread of COVID-19 and support those who are affected by it or by the job and income losses that we're seeing around the world. But hot on the heels of this initial response is a desire to reboot the economy. And some of the lessons that we learned from efforts in 2008-2009 crisis are relevant here, in particular on how we can actually build back better. Now, as you can see on this first slide, over $400 billion were spent on green stimulus measures as part of the 2008-09 response. This in total was about 15% of total fiscal stimulus. China and the US accounted for the vast majority, over 3/4 of the green spending at that time. But if you go to the next slide, we'll see that South Korea was the one who really embraced the green stimulus the most as a percentage basis. So they had about 80% of its fiscal stimulus directed to green measures. Their aim at the time was to create 960,000 green jobs between 2009 and 2012 as part of this stimulus. Now, while most countries right now are still focused on the immediate emergency measures to tackle COVID-19, South Korea is already starting to look ahead and show early signs of green stimulus action as part of its second wave of measures. They've just announced, for example, that they'll increase a subsidy for solar rooftop to 50% of total costs, up from 30% last year. So this is an approach that will increase demand for solar rooftop for both households and commercial use. It will boost jobs, and it will slash household electricity bills, benefiting households day to day. In addition, it's going to reduce emissions. Others, in particular the European Union, are also planning a green economic recovery. And the European Commission President, von der Leyen, has emphasized that their priorities are digitalization, decarbonization, and resilience. Dr. Fang Li will tell you a bit more about what China is planning. So we have some initial measures building on what we've seen. Now, if we go to the next slide, what we can see going back to 2008, 2009 was that, interestingly, GDP growth in Korea rebounded faster than the OECD as a whole after the financial crisis. Now, there's a number of reasons for this, but do recall that they were the ones who really put 80% of their fiscal stimulus into green measures. So in the first quarter of 2009, Korea was one of only a few OECD countries to have positive growth. And by the third quarter, it had a growth rate of 2.8%, one of the highest in the OECD. So next slide. If we look at the US and what we learned from 2008, 2009, there was a major recovery package, the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which injected something like $800 billion into stimulus spending, while also being the largest ever clean energy investment in US history. It provided over $90 billion in clean energy investments and tax incentives, leveraged about $150 billion in additional finance, and supported 900,000 job years in clean energy between 2009 and 2015. Now, analysis after the crisis found that in some cases, green stimulus outperformed more traditional infrastructure investments, including in terms of delivering jobs, boosting jobs in the economy. So for example, in the US, what we saw was that for major transport projects was where states spent $1 billion on public transport projects, they managed to create 4.2 million job hours in the US following the crisis, while the same amount of money spent on highways created only 2.4 million job hours. So we got almost double the amount of job hours through clean transport investments compared to highways and roads. So there's benefits there in terms of actually delivering the jobs. We have a lot of evidence of how green stimulus measures, whether through infrastructure investments, fiscal policies, through the bailout schemes, how these can actually help to boost growth, deliver the jobs that we need, and protect the most vulnerable households. What we need to do now is to draw on this evidence and look at the current circumstances and see how we can apply it. One of the key aspects that I think that will be very different this time compared to 2008-09 is really that we need to ensure we build back better in a way that enhances our resilience to future risks. We understand much better the risks from coming out of this COVID-19 crisis, and we need to ensure that we build resilience to future risks, including climate ones. I think one of the things we'll be looking for is the role of investment and our natural or green infrastructure? How can we invest in nature in a way that it actually supports rural incomes and livelihoods, delivers food security, and boosts our resilience to future risks? So thank you. I'll stop there. Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you so much, Helen. And I see we're now up to nearly 800 listeners. I hope each of our listeners is thinking about what this lesson might mean in your own work. These ideas, I think, Helen, this is such a great example of count it, change it, scale it. You've got the data right there. We'll be making the slides and the recording available. I'm hoping that there's some people listening in who will take this back to their colleagues and say, here's evidence that a green stimulus is actually the way to create jobs and growth. It's the best path forward. And with that in mind, I'm pleased to introduce Fang Li, who leads our work in China as the representative of WRI. I've had the pleasure to know Fang Li when she was a senior government official, initially in a remarkable organization called the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. It brings together Chinese thought leaders and foreign thought leaders and organizations. And then more recently, when she was a senior official in the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. She's been with us about a year now, Fang Li, and it's quite wonderful to have you here. The exam question, as Manish likes to say, that I gave Fang Li is, what can you tell us about China's economic stimulus package? Are there lessons for the world? You all, of course, know that China was hit with the virus first, that it responded quite aggressively, and that the focus is now shifting to economic recovery, even as they continue to deal with the remains of the epidemic there. Fang Li, over to you.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to share the information of coronavirus response and recovery, and hope that we really work together.
Fang Li, you cut out and we're also not seeing your picture, but we're currently not hearing you either. I'll give you a little moment to get that lined up, and if you have trouble, we'll come back to you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you now. We don't see you, but that's fine. I think the important thing is we see your slide. So please go ahead.
Yes, and thank you inviting me to share the information of coronavirus feedback and also recovery. I really hope we can work together to fight the epidemic. I will also start with the data. So that is the slide shows that from the end of the January that the China really closed down the cities. Then after the 2 weeks, we can see the number peaked. So I hope this gives you some hope that we can really combat back of the coronavirus. And also the coronavirus caused a lot of the deadly impact of the economy in different sectors. Numbers show you about the result. And also here is another figure about the purchasing managing index. That is a gauge to show the future economy activities. It's dropped down from 50 to 35.7. During 2008, the number was 38.8. So we can see that's more severe than 2008. And the other data showed us, which are provided by WeBank, which is a digital bank initiative by the China tech giant WeChat. They aggregated the mobility data from the peoples and business and industry and satellite. It shows China's economy recovery index so far till the 27th of March, back to over 86. And there are some economic sectors going different way. We give them name, untouched or light touch economy. They go the different direction. I give you two examples. the resources also from the Week Bank. The online working and online education increased dramatically. Another highlight is China's new infrastructure investment plan. And people tend to compare the new infrastructure plan with the old one. And the new plan has been long planned, and it's carrying willingness to driving China economy from the high speed to the high quality. We can see there are 5G, big data, AI, industrial internet, etc. And also that is only part of the word stimulation, as Helen already introduced. And the countries around the world are launching new stimulus. We should really pay attention on long-term implication of those plans. Here are some data. The left one is in 2008, the impact of the investment. After the infrastructure investment, we can see the emission of the carbon dioxide increased. And the right part is the global. After the global financial crisis, the global CO2 emission from fossil fuel combustion and cement plant grows faster than ever. If we think that is a really good opportunity for us, we believe there are many opportunities in the new infrastructure investment. Here we identified some areas we want to share with you. During the epidemic, we can really feel the essential of the people needs, like food. And also we got some experiences from the adaptation, especially the resilience of the city's infrastructure, and also the waste management, circular economy, transportation, and energy storage, and new energy supply. So with the big data, with the new technology, we can have more opportunity and potential opportunities. I can use half an hour to explain that. And we feel
you've got 1 more minute.
we have many challenges and opportunities. Well, in Chinese saying, the opportunities are always going along with the challenges. Here, we really feel many challenges, not only for virus itself, but also for geopolitical and anti-globalization, especially the supply chain, and also people changing agenda, put the economic first. How about biodiversity and climate change? So there are some opportunities we listed there, especially healthy supply chain, the food, especially the food supply chain, which combine the biodiversity conservation and climate change. So that is a very reflect the healthy supply chain and resilient supply chain. Thank you for your attention, and I really hope we can jointly fight together and also ignite, build back better with our green dream. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fang Li. One of the great privileges of being at WRI is the opportunity to have colleagues around the world working on these issues from different perspectives. For a US perspective, we're going to turn to Dan Lashoff, who leads the WRI US work. Dan has been working for climate action for more than 20 years, including previously at NextGen and at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Dan, over to you. You've got 4 to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Lawrence. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It was just a week ago today, and time seems to pass in very strange ways these days. Just a week ago, the United States enacted its 3rd piece of emergency legislation in response to the medical and economic crisis brought on by COVID-19. It was a $2 trillion economic rescue package, the largest in our recent history, featuring cash payments, extended unemployment insurance, medical care to treat the hundreds of thousands of Americans expected to need hospitalization over the next few weeks. And since then, as Manish mentioned, over 6 million people filed for unemployment benefits, bringing the total in the last 2 weeks to over 10 million. The scale of this economic shock is as unprecedented as the health threat that is caused by the virus itself. And as a result, discussion has already turned to what Congress should do next to reboot the US economy once it's safe for people to return to work. In the last few days, both Speaker Pelosi and President Trump have called for Congress to enact a phase 4 emergency measure consisting of more than $2 trillion of additional spending, including, in this case, a major infrastructure investment component. And while Senate Majority Leader McConnell has called for a more cautious wait-and-see approach, most economists agree that additional economic stimulus will be needed, and members of Congress and their staff are already working to put the next bill together. So what could be the central elements of an effort to not only get people back to work as quickly as possible, but also lay the groundwork for the clean energy transition that we must make to avert the worst consequences of the climate crisis? I'll focus on 4 areas: renewable energy and grid upgrades, transportation electrification, building retrofits, and tree restoration. Next slide. First, we need to revive the wind and solar industries, which employed 350,000 people in the United States before the pandemic struck and was one of the fastest growing sectors of the US economy. We can do that by extending the existing tax credits and temporarily allowing cash payments in lieu of tax credits, as was done in 2009. We will also need to upgrade the grid that connects renewable energy to our homes and businesses in a flexible and smart way so that we can take full advantage of our abundant renewable resources. Next slide. Second, we can bring idle factories back online to build electric school and transit buses, which will cut down on the diesel pollution damaging the lungs of our kids while lowering operating costs for school districts and transit systems throughout the country. And we can put electricians and construction crews back to work installing the charging infrastructure that we will need to support a growing electric vehicle fleet. Next slide. Third, we will need to get the over 2 million Americans in the energy efficiency industry back on the job of upgrading our buildings. Greatly expanding the low-income home weatherization program is one way to provide assistance to the population hardest hit by the economic crisis while reducing the emissions that contribute to the climate crisis. And by retrofitting our schools and hospitals with more efficient equipment and renewable energy microgrids, we can lower costs and make our critical infrastructure more resilient to the next crisis, whatever that is brought by, whether fire or flood or the next pandemic. Next slide. Fourth, we could create 150,000 jobs starting immediately by committing resources to a major tree restoration effort, targeting not just forests, but also agricultural land and urban landscapes. A sustained effort could eventually plant 60 billion trees in the United States and remove over 500 million tons per year of CO2 from the atmosphere. A significant contribution to the global Trillion Trees initiative, which has strong bipartisan support. As the saying goes, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. By making a major investment now in programs that simultaneously create jobs and build sustainable infrastructure, the seedlings of a solution to the climate crisis can grow out of our current crisis. Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Dan. We're going to turn now to my colleague, Wanjira Matai. Wanjira typically shows up on many lists of Africa's most influential. One of those many lists came out just last week. I had the great privilege of spending time with you, Wanjira. It seems like an age ago when you brought together your Africa staff and others from across our network to create a new strategy. Blessedly, Africa has not been hit hard by the virus. We pray that it will stay that way, but even if it doesn't get hit biomedically, it's certainly going to get hit economically. And so I know that many people are eager to hear your views on what the current crisis means for Africa. And because Africa is already home to the majority of the world's poor people, and that is expected to increase as time goes on, I also asked you to say something about what Africa's partners, what those outside could be doing to be helpful. Over to you.
Lawrence, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for your time this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. You're right, Lawrence. Africa has seems to have been spared so far, but I have to say the impact of the virus and the crisis that it will precipitate will hit us significantly. It already has. But I want to start by commending African countries and African governments for the attention, the balancing act that they're actually going through. It is unprecedented in so many ways, what's going on around the world. But at the same time, for our economies that are extremely vulnerable to be balancing the absolute vulnerability of livelihoods and jobs and with curfews and shutdowns and school closings and closing down airports, which in many ways threaten the value chains and the supply chains of so much that makes our countries and our economies tick. So I want to first start by saying how grateful we are for the balancing act that is currently going on, and the cushioning and really the big message for all of us has been clear. We have got to cut transmission. We cannot afford a big hit. Our health systems just are not able to handle it. But that said, I want to focus first on what I think African economies must do, because I think we have to look, this crisis in many ways has just torn us apart in a way and helped us realize that internally we have got to find our own solutions. We've got to innovate. We've got to explore ways to secure food security for our populations. And yes, we will need our friends, but at the moment, like somebody else said, it is probably unprecedented that we are all going through these problems at the same time. So I know that economies around the world will be dealing with this. But for us, the governance and the strength of our governance, the strength of our systems, and certainly the strength of our social capital will be tested in ways that has not happened before. I think for many African governments right now, they're organizing themselves around how to engage international bilateral and multilateral institutions to pull together whatever economic stimulus can be pulled together, and acknowledging that our GDPs just don't have what it takes for the kind of most predictions, the best of them saying will be under 1%, but probably even sub-zero growth rates. So working with our international and bilateral partners will be critically important. But I think what's exciting is what it's doing in terms of internally getting private sector and public sector to work together, working together around critical value chains. And I particularly want to focus on the food value chain, because food at the moment is one of the most critically threatened value chains and supply chains, and one that we cannot afford under any circumstances to have blocked, because it could precipitate different challenges for us as a country and as countries that would be even more damaging. And so most of our countries at the moment are looking at ways to ensure that we keep the food supply chains flowing, that we ensure that whatever happens, that we keep as flat as possible the price of food, and ensure that low income and densely populated areas have access to food. So most important for us are creating some of those local loops and linkages that will ensure that food supply continues to flow, and that these critical value chains are protected. And these include, fortunately, value chains that are coming out from countries that rely on food that comes from outside, that those avenues remain open. Even as we close our ports to human traffic, we continue to allow the traffic of food and food products, because that is critical for the survival of populations. Government must also ensure that farmers who are extremely vulnerable continue to be able to do what they need to do to ensure that the food supply continues to come. So cushioning farmers at this point and ensuring that the inputs that are required, many of which may be relying on supply chains outside the country, continue to flow. And then we've got to start thinking about new ways of ensuring that our landscapes are resilient and are continue to serve the populations and protect vulnerable populations. I always remember the fact that for years and centuries, our landscapes have cushioned us against so much adversity. And this, at times like this, that we must begin to understand the imbalance that has been caused by our activity. And I'm proud that even in our Africa strategy, we are focusing on a concept of vital landscapes and what that means in terms of building resilience around food, water, and energy systems. I see you telling me to stop. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Wanjira, thank you very much. I want to reassure our audience that we are going to have, as part of our series, a deep dive on Africa. This is, if you will, just a sampler of the knowledge. I want to turn now to Anjali Mahendra. Anjali is the Director of Research at the W.I. Ross Center for Sustainable Cities and has been co-lead on a multi-year project called Towards a More Equal City. And in monitoring the Q&A, an anonymous attendee wrote in and said, "Can you please say something about the role of cities? They are central to the epidemic." So to our anonymous listener, Anjali's here just in time to give you the answer to that question. Anjali, thank you so much for joining us. I should mention that Anjali has worked here in the United States for the Environmental Protection Agency and Department of Transportation, but also directing our research in India. So you're bringing a multiple of perspectives to this in addition to your deep knowledge of cities. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. And what a great question and a good segue into what I'm going to say. You know, we are seeing that cities and urban areas are at the front lines of the COVID-19 impact. Their healthcare services are overwhelmed. Public transit systems are not functioning. And they're struggling, as Wanjira will attest, in many parts of the world to even provide basic access to water and sewerage for hand washing needs. People are, of course, losing their jobs. And in all of this, we're seeing that low-income people are suffering the most. So as we think of these economic stimulus packages and as countries and governments are reassessing their priorities, we really need to use this opportunity for cities to be able to build back better, to be more resilient, more low carbon, and certainly more equitable. So I'm going to share my screen quickly and share some observations on what we're seeing and some lessons we've learned from about 5 years of work we've been doing deeply on looking at how cities can be much more equitable and resilient. Give me just a second. I want to make sure everybody sees my screen. Yes. So first of all, first observation, what this pandemic is doing is it's exposing the existing fault lines in cities with respect to lacking physical infrastructure and inequalities access to core services. Large proportions of people don't have decent housing to self-isolate, basic water and sanitation. They don't have access to healthcare or transport options. And these challenges, as Manish mentioned, you know, that they cope with every day are now exacerbated by the crisis. So what you see on the slide is an image of an informal settlement, African city, and you can see the density. Social distancing is simply impossible for about 1 billion people in the world who live in such informal settlements, in developing countries primarily. The second observation is that this pandemic is showing us the fragility of employment and jobs that cities depend on, the jobs that underpin urban economies. We've already heard the millions of people who in the US who've lost their jobs, but you also have informal workers in cities around the world with no employment contracts, no insurance, no income to depend on, and they're facing the tough choice of either exposing themselves to the virus or dealing with hunger for themselves and their families. And these jobs in the informal sector, the gig economy, the low-wage formal sector jobs, they're crucial in cities. Look at the image I have on the slide, your typical commercial area in a city with street vendors and all the retail that we're seeing so badly hit in this pandemic. And what we're lacking are the fiscal and social safety nets so essential to build that economic resilience in times like these. The third observation is, of course, that this is an immense opportunity to build back better, right, for cities. Why that's so is because we know that economic, social, and environmental resilience are all interlinked. Cities as systems, and so nowhere do you see this playing out more clearly than in cities. The pandemic has, of course, created a big opportunity to build back more inclusively, more resiliently, and more sustainably. So what do cities need to do? I'm going to quickly touch on 5 things that I hope we can consider as we think about these economic stimulus packages. So first, we must shore up urban economies with strong social and fiscal safety nets that are geared at informal and low-wage workers, essential workers. We need to provide the income support and the health services that they need. Second, we must bring a laser-sharp focus on investing in infrastructure and housing for better health, well-being, and resilience. And what this involves is identifying those high-risk locations, those poor and under-resourced communities in cities like New York and New Orleans here, or those informal settlements that I'm showing a picture of around the world. This is a picture of Mumbai. And we need to identify the locations, but also invest in these vulnerable communities. Third point is the governance that Manjira also made. We need to improve governance to allow for a more seamless national and local coordination, not just in these times of emergency, but as we recover, making sure fiscal transfers are tailored to the needs of specific cities. Next, we need targeted financial support for the most vulnerable urban residents so that basic services, including healthcare, remain accessible and affordable. We need cash transfers for vulnerable groups. We're already seeing that happening in the US, but also in the kinds of settlements you see in this picture. We need support for livelihoods in so many of these cities around the world. And last, but most important probably to everything I've said so far, is that the need for data and information. We must generate the required data at the city and neighborhood scale, granular data, to respond to conditions on the ground and monitor them in an ongoing way, in partnership with communities. Hong Kong and Singapore set up these public health response systems during the SARS outbreak. And that has prepared them well to handle the crisis now. This is something we've seen coming up slowly in many cities around the world, but we really need to ramp up action there. So that's it, Lawrence. Just some ideas that we need to think about in these stimulus packages that serve the needs of cities in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anjali. We have an embarrassment of questions, and despite my best efforts, we are up against the hour. What I would propose is I'm going to read some of the questions. My colleague Reese has been cherry picking some of the most interesting. I'm going to read 3 of them and direct panelists to answer them. I think what I would suggest to the panelists in the audience is that those who are willing and able to stay on for 5 or 10 minutes past the hour, there seems to be a lot of interest, will do so. I know that we'll see a drop off at the hour, both from the participants and perhaps from some of the panelists, but I think enough of us can stay on that we can do a little bit of justice to the questions. I believe we'll also be able to capture the questions and get back to many of you. Finally, I would mention that this is the first of a series of seminars. If you are not already signed up for the WRI Digest, please go online and sign up. That's a great way to get the invitations to these things. And we hope to see many of you at future events. There is a question, and Anjali, I'm going to come to you at the end since you just finished talking, but this is one I've spotted that Reese picked up. It's from Anan Malouf, and he says, how can we restore trust in cities such as mass transit? So if you can be thinking about that. And Reese has also picked a question from Jay Eden. Will the COVID crisis and oil price crash make it easier or harder for international oil companies to embrace the energy transition. That sounds like one for Helen, but I have a different one for you, Helen, which is on the impact of the crisis on the UN climate conference, what climate aficionados call COP26. Of course, the announcement has just come out that that has been postponed. A new date has yet to be set. So, Helen, I'd like you to take the COP26 question, and maybe Dan, I know that you track energy closely, and certainly subsidies for oil companies are a live political issue here in the US. So I might ask Dan to take the oil question, then Helen on COP26, and if you want to add just a smidge on the oil question, because I know that you think a lot about that, and then Anjali on resilience. And meanwhile, I'll be looking for another round of questions, especially, Reese, if you spot questions relevant for Africa or China, it's very helpful for me the way you're putting those up in our private chat. Thank you very much. Dan, easier or harder for oil companies to become energy companies when the bottom falls out of the price of their product?
Yeah, that's a hugely important and really tough question. I've seen very strong arguments on both sides of that. I think on the positive side that it makes it easier. The volatility and decrease in oil prices certainly is making reducing drilling activity, and particularly in more difficult to access resources like the US shale. So the question is, will those resources be redeployed into cleaner energy? On the other hand, with cheap oil, will that slow down the momentum for investment in alternatives? I think both are true at the same time, and ultimately the answer will depend on what kinds of policies governments put in place moving forward.
Thanks very much. I would say to our panelists, Helen has been remarkably double tasking answering questions. So panelists, if you look at the Q&A panel, you'll see open questions. If you answer one of those questions, then it becomes an answered question and is visible to the participants. So if any of you is inclined to answer something, please do. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we can answer some of those questions. Helen, question about the impact on the UN climate conference and maybe more broadly on the international process, which WRI has been so closely involved in for many years. Does this totally go off the rails? How does it continue?
Thanks, Lawrence. I think the brief answer is absolutely not. It does not go totally off the rails. I think what we're seeing from COVID-19, the kind of risks we're seeing and how they impact on the economy, on society, on people around the world, only highlights even more so the importance of managing better and reducing risks for the future, including the risks of widespread climate change. So I think at the moment, this actually highlights even more so the urgency of tackling climate change rather than less. The challenge we face is that, of course, governments right now are focusing heavily on how to manage and deal with the immediate COVID-19 crisis, and that's where they need to focus. But that does mean pretty much every other issue is lower on the agenda than normal. What we're seeing is that, as we highlighted in the seminar, there are a number of opportunities where you can actually tackle both the COVID-19 crisis, reboot the economy coming out of that, deliver the jobs that we need, help vulnerable households. We can do that and also do it in a way which is good for climate action. So there is a potential to actually accelerate climate action as we're building a new, more robust, more sustainable and equitable economy. There is that potential, and what we're going to be doing and many others is helping to highlight where those opportunities are and what governments can do to seize those so we can build back better, both for people, for the economy, and for the climate. Now, COP26, I mean, as many will have seen a couple of days ago, the Bureau and the UK presidency announced that they're going to have to delay COP26 from November this year into 2021. Haven't set yet a date. I think one of the things we're going to be doing is working with them and supporting others on how can we keep up momentum on climate action over this period to ensure that by the time we get to COP26, we actually are moving further and faster in terms of tackling climate risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I'm going to turn next to Anjali, but first I have a question here for Wanjira. I'm going to give you the question so you can think about it, and then while Anjali is responding to the question, then I'll call on you next. It's a question really for the world, but I think it's one that I know you have thought a lot about in Africa. Much of the focus on potential green stimulus packages has been on low carbon clean technology. How can we shift some of the focus to investments in adaptation and resilience building? I know that resilience is a key issue in Africa. So Anjali, the question for you was, how can we restore trust in cities? And I think it was focused on transport, but it goes more broadly to the question of, WRI has been advocating for compact, connected cities. There's a lot to be said for compact. You can walk, you don't need a car, they're more vibrant. Turns out they may also be a better place for spreading the virus. Is there going to be some serious rethinking about the compact nature of cities, and how can we restore trust in transport, public transport?
Sure. A few questions in there. So one, just on the compactness issue, this is, we've been seeing these debates around density. I've shown you some pictures around informal settlements and so on. The problem, and I really want to emphasize this because our own work and the engagements and partnerships we have with many others who think about this issue show us density is not the problem per se. You break down density into things like overcrowding, floor space occupancy, and so on, and access to services, and you see that density starts becoming a problem when there is overcrowding and there is lack of physical infrastructure and good quality access to services. That's when quality of life starts getting compromised. That's when these kind of outbreaks occur. Hong Kong, Singapore, the cities that are dealing abundantly fine with this crisis are incredibly dense. So, we do not want to talk about revisiting why cities exist and what is the added sort of value that they bring in terms of density and agglomeration economies and so on. On public transit, this is a very interesting question and a struggle because of the way this crisis has unfolded. It's a respiratory illness. Social distancing norms mean you cannot be packed together in public transit. But we must not forget that public transit is the mode that the majority of people use around the world, particularly, again, lower middle class, low income people, to get to their jobs, to get to essential services, education, and so on. And so this is not the time to pull back investment in public transit. Yes, we're seeing low ridership and cities will need to struggle. Their public transport agencies will struggle for some time. However, somebody raised an interesting question about micro-mobility options like promoting bicycling and walking infrastructure at this time. This is the need of the hour now, so that as we build back more resiliently, more low carbonly, in a more low carbon way, and more equitably, we can use these micro-mobility services that we invest in now as feeders to public transit and ramp up ridership. There's a lot of strategies in the playbook. I think this is something we should be focusing on. One other last point on trust. I made a point about how cities need to work in partnership with communities, particularly vulnerable communities, and identify the ones at risk, invest in them. This is really a way to build that trust with communities. Make sure that you're communicating downward in terms of health messages and livelihood opportunities and so on. Make sure that you're working with communities to gather data on their needs and how to respond to them. At the same time, make sure that you're partnering with them to co-create solutions that work best for them. So this is a way many cities have shown us they have built trust with communities, and I think this process it's begun. It needs to continue much more after the pandemic.
Thank you, Anjali. Wanjira, I'm going to give you just 1 minute on the resilience question. This is just a teaser. We'll be coming back for more on this. And then Fang Li, you noticed some questions on trade. You haven't yet responded to a question, so I'm going to ask you to respond 1 minute on trade. And then I'm going to turn to Manish for closing thoughts. Wanjira, over to you.
Thanks, Lawrence. Just a very quick example. When I think about this idea of adaptation and building resilience, I'm reminded of this concept of food security at the family level. We often used to ask people, if you had to stay in and lock down for a week, would you have enough food in your kitchen garden, in your home, in your farm to feed yourself and your family? And the whole idea of urban farming and food security at the family level becomes such an important concept now, as people are thinking about what they can do when food security is challenged overnight. And so I think that's one really good example I can give about how we can build resilience, is to begin to think about food security or security around different issues at the family level.
Thank you, Wanjir. Fang Li, up to 1 minute on trade.
Thank you. In terms of the trade issues, I always have problem. You know, China is the biggest country of more than 120 countries. And also China also relying on the soft commodity, especially the food, agriculture, soft commodity trade. And during the epidemic, we noticed that at the beginning, the countries would like to cut down the trade. But finally, we see the country rely on the trade and to support the country, each other. So I really think that through the trade and supply chain or value chain, it's a link to the country, to each other. And also country can help to each other. And more globalization of the trade is more kind of the stable. But for some of the essential or essential need products, and we also think about how to make the safety. So that is also, it's kind of the issue to balance the international trade and efficiency and the security. So I think that normally speaking, the stable trade and sustainable trade is healthy for the global economy and also for food supply chain. So that is what I'm understanding. Any law, any world trade is a kind of the destroy for nature conservation. If some country cannot plant the soft commodity, the other country is going to cut down the tree, deforestation, then have the soft commodity continually. So trade stable is also kind of a way to protect the nature conservation.
Thank you, Manish. Closing remarks. Despite my best efforts, we are over time by 5 minutes now. So I know you have thoughts on many of these things. If you can give us 1 minute, and we'll bless and release our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you all. There are a lot of excellent questions that we haven't been able to get to, and we will try to respond to them kind of offline. I just wanted to close with just a real quick reflection. Today, 52 years ago, was the day that Martin Luther King made his very last speech. He was assassinated actually on April 4th. And just reminded me of one of, perhaps one of the most memorable speeches of the 20th century was when he said, I have a dream. He didn't say, I have a nightmare. He said, I have a dream. Even at a time when civil rights in the United States were so abysmal, were so poor, that even in the throes of that despair, he reimagined what a future could look like. And I think we're at a point now, and I'm still quite concerned about just how terrifying this pandemic is going to be and the human costs that this is going to have globally. But if we can find a way to reimagine how we look at our economy, how we look at society, how we create a new social contract for those that are most vulnerable between different countries, if we can reimagine that to me is the opportunity over the next 12, 18 months. And WRI is going to stay focused on our issues, but we feel that this new reality does create an unprecedented opportunity for something truly different. And we invite you to join us in working together to help create that more inclusive, that more low carbon, that much more resilient and sustainable world. So thank you all.
Thank you, Manish. I think the key word here is to invite you to join us. I want to thank you all who joined us and tell you that if you'd like to know more about these things, if you look at the event page that was up and then look at the staff bio, many of our panelists today are prolific writers and thinkers, and you can find on their bio a tab for their blog posts and their publications. You can read more. We'll be creating a COVID-19 response and recovery page to bring this together, and we will be organizing additional seminars. The best way to get those invitations is to sign up for the WRI Digest online. If you're not already there, please do. Thank you all for joining us. I'll do a better job managing next time so we can get to more of the questions, and we will follow up. For those of you who we know your identity, we'll do our best to get back to you. Thank you for the many wonderful questions. Final thought, somebody said, and I'm not sure it's entirely true, but Jean said, in all traditional wars, men go to the front to fight, and women show they are very capable of doing the men's jobs they left in the factories. Now women are at the front, healthcare workers, educators, and men are working from home and taking care of the kids. It is clear which jobs are most important now. What impact will this have? So that is a perspective I had not been thinking about. I wanted to leave you with that thought. Thank you all, and we hope to see many of you at our next seminar. Bye-bye.